Our next speaker is Kiefer. He's a computer musician, musical instrument designer, and lecturer in music technology at the University of Sussex. As a live coder, he performs under the name Numa. He plays an augmented, self-resonating cello as half of improv duo Feedback Cello, and with the Feedback Drone Quartet Brain Dead Ensemble. He co-runs the HRRC Feedback Musicianship Network. His research specializes in musician-computer interaction, physical computing, machine learning, and complex systems. Chris, welcome, and you can start your talk.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so thank you, Adriana, for the invite to talk today. And I really wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, well, Zoom, hopefully Zoom will work fine. So I'm going to talk about feedback and feedback musicianship. And under the theme of analog digital interaction, I'm going to show quite a lot of instruments that meld acoustic materials with analog and digital sound production techniques. So I'm going to talk a bit about what are feedback instruments, what is feedback musicianship, talk about a network which has been running for the last year, which has been gathering musicians and researchers in this area to really kind of share and figure out the research agenda ahead. And I'll show some examples of contemporary feedback instruments, and then finish off by talking about the research challenges in the area which have kind of arisen from these meetings in the network. So first of all, what is feedback musicianship? So of course, feedback crops up in a lot of places in computer music. Filters use feedback, for example. But what we're really talking about in feedback musicianship is instruments that use feedback as one of the prominent ways of sound production or interaction with the instrument. So that use feedback as a creative material. And here's a few examples here. We can go back to an early documented example in the 50s, guitar Slim on the left, and of course Jimi Hendrix later, who used amp and guitar sound feedback musically. So instead of, this was marking the transition from trying to get rid of feedback as something that was annoying and uncomfortable to listen to using it musically. Some other examples could be Eliane Radigue, who did some really wonderful feedback, kind of microphone speaker feedback compositions in the 60s. Nikolas Collins and his famous piece Soup, room feedback piece. Descipio, who was focused on more kind of non-linear dynamical systems and how they interact with each other in situated systems. The bowl of electronics there is from John Bowers, who created this wonderful instrument that's literally a bowl of random electronics, and you put probes in it and it makes complex feedback circuits which create sounds, and you play it by probing around in the bowl. Some contemporary examples, we've got Tom, who I think is in the Zoom room, who looks at complex systems and software instruments, kind of hacking physical models at the moment, and gutter synthesis. And bottom right is Haldur Ulfarsson, who's designed this instrument called the Halduraphone, which is a cello-like instrument which self-resonates. And that's seen quite a lot of success at the moment, used in Hollywood soundtracks, for example. So let's move to the next screen. So what I'll do is just play a minute of a piece with a feedback instrument. This is from Adam Pulse Melbu, and he has a kind of child of the Halduraphone called the feedback actuated bass, which is a double bass with a speaker in the back, pickups to pick up the strings, and the sound circulates through the instrument. So let's just listen to a minute of that to get a flavor of these sorts of instruments. So as you can see there, the way Adam's playing that instrument, he's putting energy into it by bowing, but it's also self-resonating. So the instrument sort of has a life of its own. It almost plays itself. And one of the ways that people play these instruments is it's more about guiding the behavior of the instrument than kind of top-down control with conventional instruments. So I'm going to talk about this thing called the Feedback Musicianship Network, which is funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council that's been running for the past year and has ended now with some small ongoing activities. And this was led by myself and Dan Overholtz from University Copenhagen. And I'll just talk about a few of the activities to give a flavor of the idea of this network was to bring people working in feedback music, researchers, artists together to share and learn from each other and figure out where we need to research, what are the real challenges in feedback musicianship at the moment. And so I'll talk about some of the activities as a way of giving a flavor of what's going on in this world at the moment, or at least within the world of this network, because this network was a little snapshot of a lot more wider activities in feedback music. So we had a few online meetings. Adam's performance you just saw, Vivin, who's talking next, I think, came and talked about his plexiglass instrument that uses piezo microphone finger touch feedback. And we had Semiconductor Films who talked about an installation they made that was installed at CERN, which is a very large room scale string feedback instrument, which was fed by data from the collider. So these are all discussions about different techniques, about how people use feedback to make music in different ways. We've had 3 keynotes. We've had Nikolas Collins, who's been working with feedback, he has a lot of experience from Pea Soup onwards, and his work with Lucia as well. We've had Christina Anderson come and talk, who talks more about the design side of feedback instruments and how we can think about complexity in the way that we design. And we've had Kathy Van Eck, who talked to us about her way of making instruments using speakers, microphones, and so on. We've also had several concerts. This is the first one in Copenhagen. And we had a variety of different instruments, some string instruments. So the picture is Palle Darstel, who was playing. I'll talk about that one in a second, actually. We've had another meeting in Corfu and Athens. And this example on the left, I'll use that to illustrate something a bit later. This is a feedback drying rack, which actually sounded really, really quite wonderful. And as an example of the kind of simple ways which you can make really complex sounds with these sorts of techniques. And then we've recently had a meeting at Sussex where we had a more kind of club style audiovisual performances, and then kind of church concert with quite a variety of so feedback cymbals, some string instruments, and feedback ensemble as well. We've had quite a lot of discussions in this network because that's what it was really about. We've experimented with a lot of techniques for sharing between musicians, researchers, and that's currently being written up as a research agenda in a paper. And yeah, that's part of the ongoing activities of the network. So that paper is being written at the moment. We're also working on the design of an open source instrument for education, the kind of thing that you could make in your NIME class, which would kind of help people understand principles behind feedback instruments. So here's some examples of contemporary instruments, and I'm grouping these into the kind of techniques that people use to make feedback. So the first one here is vibrotactile self-resonating. Adam's feedback actuated double bass was an example of one of these instruments earlier. This is Dan Overholt's overtoned fiddle. And the idea with these instruments is they'll have some sort of exciter or speaker built into them, and some way of picking up sound like a microphone or pickups, various different sorts of pickups, and some way of processing sound, which in this case, in Dan's instrument, is an iPod doing a DSP. Other people use analog techniques. There's plenty of ways you can do that. And this builds a self-resonating system, which usually if you leave it, just switch it on, it will converge to kind of sine wave feedback usually. But when you play it, you might shape the way that it interacts. The feedback moves around the system. So you find some point of intervention in the circular system, whether that be damping strings or controlling parameters in the signal processing, or moving a microphone or speaker around. So you find some way of intervention to kind of stay at the edge between sine wave feedback and silence. And somewhere in the middle, there's some really interesting stuff to play with. Another example is information system feedback. So this is Paller's Baroque organ. And what he did was, so it's a MIDI, it's not a vibrotactile instrument, it's a MIDI system, but he had a kind of semi-generative system where information flows around. So what you play is it flows around a system and things get pulled out of databases, and kind of the notes it's a symbolic system. And so it's using symbolic feedback, I guess. There's quite a bit of work in audiovisual feedback. This is Henrik von Kohler's instrument from the Athens performances, where he's using cameras that are filming cymatics, and there's information going around that system which kind of modulates how it behaves as a whole. And there's quite a bit of work going on in software. So Tom Mudd, who I mentioned earlier, also Dario Sanfilippo, and this is his system that he played with in Athens, which looks at kind of complex systems techniques. And actually what he did was he kind of triggered the system off, and he didn't really know what was going to happen in this performance, and he just let it evolve over time. So in the last part, I'm going to talk about some research challenges. So first of all, notation. And how do we notate these instruments? We don't often know how they're going to behave. They're quite unpredictable, or can be quite unpredictable. So describing their behavior is one thing. Another thing is knowing that they're going to do the same thing twice on 2 different days, which is part of the appeal of playing these sorts of instruments, but also makes them difficult to predict what's going to happen. So we, as part of the challenge of that, we've managed to get some funding to commission Lars Kunde to write some pieces for Feedback Ensemble, and we have formed an ensemble of 7 instruments. So there were 5 feedback string instruments, a kind of Tom's software instrument, and then Paul Stapleton's kind of assemblage of lots of different feedback components. And Lars was up for the challenge of this, and this is an example of some of the notation. So as you can see here, that this notation is very, very broad. And in fact, in rehearsals, we kind of sat down and we negotiated which instrument would sound best with the different parts of this piece here. And so it's very much about negotiating how it might work and giving kind of overall meta shape of the piece rather than specifics like play this pitch for this amount of time. So there's plenty of challenges there in describing and predictability, really. Another challenge is in how do we shape the behavior of these instruments? And maybe this relates to the AI chat earlier, that they're kind of black boxes, that they're quite unpredictable. We don't know what they're going to do. Is there any, sometimes they can sound awful sometimes. We can get really kind of screamy feedback, which we don't like. They can go silent as well. If you leave them alone just for their behavior to evolve, that's the likely end point, either silence or some sort of unpleasant feedback. So how do you get these instruments in the middle, and how do you make the zone of playability, which you might say is kind of edge of chaos, how do you widen out that zone so you can stay, so when you find a good behavior, then you can stay there and explore that behavior. So playing these instruments is very exploratory, and maybe there's ways to make exploration easier and more musical. Another challenge is the language of feedback musicianship. So we need to rethink how we talk about musical instruments for these instruments. We might not be talking about them in the same way that we do conventional or non-feedback instruments. So one approach is to really embrace the fact that they are complex dynamical systems and start to use dynamical systems language to talk about how they behave. So maybe it's useful that we can learn from cybernetics to talk about these instruments and the work of people like Ross Ashby, for example. And we can think about attractors and orbit cycles and talk about their behavior in this complex systems language. Maybe that's a useful thing, maybe it isn't. That's a question that's out there at the moment. Next challenge is to think about how we understand their behavior. So when I could talk from the personal perspective of playing the feedback cello, it'd be really useful to be able to analyze this instrument and see how it responded in different situations. And actually we've worked with some engineers looking at kind of acoustic models of how these instruments behave. But there are a lot of challenges here because conventional acoustic analysis has a tendency to want to linearize and make linear models of systems, where feedback music is more about embracing the complexity of these instruments. So there's a bit of a dissonance there in trying to figure out how they work really. A kind of fundamental question is what's the appeal of feedback instruments? And I should note that these instruments pictured here, they're made by luthier Christian Blandhol. He's on our website. In fact, all this stuff I've shown you, the videos, everything else is on our website, which I'll put a link to at the end. But he's been working for years making these modified guitars, which are modified as feedback instruments with speakers in. And so what's the real appeal of playing these instruments? So some people talk about agency and how instead of top-down control, as you might expect when you're playing the piano or the drums or something, these instruments have a bit more of a life of their own. They're unpredictable, almost like playing partners, like playing with another person. The instrument is almost like another person. Some people really enjoy the loss of control and the way that we can kind of shift agency away from ourselves into the instrument. And maybe there's something sonic about feedback that's quite appealing as well, about the complexity of the sounds that these instruments produce. So that's another thing that we're thinking about at the moment in the network. And I think lastly, how do we communicate and share the technologies behind these instruments? So sometimes anyone can make a feedback instrument. The drying rack here is an example. You take a transducer, you take a microphone, you take some sort of vibrating resonant material and put them all together, and you've got a musical instrument to really good effects in this case. And but some of these require specialist materials, different exciters, different specialist microphones. So how do we communicate the design with, how do you think about the understanding of complex systems in the design of these instruments? So then a final thought, because I think I'm probably out of time. So this is coming to some discussion that was ongoing in the network. And this is really, really hand-wavy, I admit that, but we live in a really complicated world at the moment that's probably getting more complex quite rapidly. And maybe feedback, the current interest in feedback systems could be some kind of result of our need to understand the world in complex terms instead of linear terms at the moment. And maybe feedback instruments are a good way to get an intuitive understanding of complexity, which might help appreciate the issues we're facing on a wider scale at the moment. So that is it. There's the URL for our website. And so that all the media and documentation we've collected over the last year is there. There's plenty of, all the concerts were recorded, all the keynotes. So please do go and have a look if you're interested. Thank you.
Is there any comment or question from the audience in the room? I could just start by with a very simple question. I was wondering how large could be the scope of the feedback instruments. I was thinking of those glass harmonicas, very old, 19th century. In Portuguese, we call it copperphone. It's also got to do with some feedback, I think. But I'm not sure if they could ever be considered as feedback instruments.
Okay, I don't know the glass harmonica actually, but I suppose what we think about with these feedback instruments from a design point of view is that there's usually an extra energy coming into the system that's not from the player. So for example, in the bass that Adam was playing in the video, there's electricity driving the speaker, and circulating extra sound around. So aside from the energy from the bow or from plucking the instrument, it's got another energy source. So that means it has a way of having its own, to kind of support its own agency. But I don't know if you can say, I don't know about the glass harmonica, but.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering this because at the time it was also seen as an instrument we could not really control, as you just mentioned, and was also very much related to spirits and to very scary sounds, and they were actually used in the Phantasmagoria shows to scare people out. That's why I was making this connection. But in any case, what other instruments could be included in the scope of the feedback instruments apart from those that you've shown?
Good question. Well,
would you ever include the piano, for example?
No, I wouldn't, because I think the characteristic is that there's some sort of circularity in the instrument. So the piano, the human player puts energy in by playing the keys, and then that energy dissipates through the instrument. In a feedback instrument, we capture that energy and circulate it back somehow. So whether that's or maybe it's not energy, maybe it's the signal, we could say, because we have to include software instruments in this as well. So there's some kind of flow of information or energy that's additional to what the musician puts in.
Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Again, not so much of a question as just a comment. First, I can fill in a little bit of information about the glass harmonica, which was invented, to the best of my knowledge, by Benjamin Franklin. And it's basically a Helmholtz resonator, a series of Helmholtz resonators, a series of glass bottles that are spinning and are basically rubbed in the same way that a violin string is rubbed. And so that is, to the best of my knowledge, what a glass harmonica is. And yes, indeed, spooky sound. But back to the topic of, so that's glass harmonica, Benjamin Franklin. But back to the topic of feedback instruments, you know, I watch a ton of YouTube videos, off-grid stuff about free energy. So is there some kind of idea with a feedback instrument that the instrument is actually generating the electricity that is creating the feedback, that is generating the electricity, that is creating the feedback. Now, of course, we know Newton, it's against the law. you can't. but is there some sort of a way you can take a feedback instrument that actually essentially powers down the system to such that it is almost self-powered?
Yeah, good question. I don't know of such an instrument, but I think the kind of general theme of these instruments being kind of more than the sum of their parts might fit in with what you're saying. But yeah, I don't know of any sort of energy recycling.
Okay, I have one little question. You were talking about the research goal of creating a feedback system for educational purposes. And I would like, of course, you are in the process of working, but I would like to know whether you have already established some insights or some guidelines. To which extent is a feedback instrument for educational purposes different from a feedback instrument for single author? I mean, are there some requisites involved in that, or why do you use that word? I mean, what are the differences between one and the other?
Yeah, so the instrument's design is ongoing, but the education part of it is that we wanted to we're kind of inspired by the Cracklebox of a kind of small handheld battery instrument that you could kind of pick up and easily play. But the educational side of this is that we want to make something simple which demonstrates the principles of feedback musicianship, but it is also easy to make and customize. So something that you could make with your undergraduate students with it kind of easy to solder, easy to 3D print components, and some sort of teaching materials surrounding experiments you could do with these systems. And also the instruments is going to be modular in the way that you could use 2 or 3 of them together and link them together in different ways to explore different ways of making feedback.
That was a very straightforward answer. Thank you.
Hello, Chris.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I thought it was a good history of the instruments and feedback. Maybe you could have had also Steve Reich's pendulum music.
Yeah.
Concerning this question about complexity in the context of feedback systems, I mean, I was thinking that you have in the part of aesthetics in England, very famous composer, Brian Ferneyhough, and this whole movement of new complexity. And they approach it from a completely different angle. From the books of Ferneyhough, he talks that complexity comes from a complexity of relationships, not because you have a lot of black ink in the paper. And from which you also mentioned, that I think it's extremely interesting, the work of Discipio. There, it's a different conception, because it's searching about emergence from something unpredictable at the start. So you have different kinds of approaches. And also, just like white noise, you could say it has a high entropy, but maybe the complexity is not so high. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what complexity means in the context of your research about feedback instruments? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think what you say about relationships from Ferneyhough is bang on. So I think of complexity as a complex system is something that you can't understand the behavior of if you isolate its individual components. So in the feedback cello, if we take some strings, if we take an amplifier, if we take an exciter and look at those separately, we can't understand how the feedback system is going to work. So when you put them all together. And so it's really about the relationships between those components and what emerges when you put them together, and what emerges when you look at different ways of interacting with the instrument after you've put it together from those components. So maybe in feedback instruments, there's a kind of extra layer that's beyond relationships and about interacting as a player with those relationships as well.
Okay. Well, do we have any other questions? I was just wondering, Chris. It came to my mind. Your talk brought to my mind video art and how the first video artists have explored video feedback. I'm wondering how well accepted is today the feedback music in terms of festivals, concerts, and so on. Can you just tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that's one of the things that got talked about quite a lot in the network meetings. And one of the reasons that the network came together is because there's a lot of disparate activity around the world looking at feedback instruments and how we can bring people together to maybe promote feedback music as a thing. Maybe we need to think about how it looks as a whole. But we've got a few high-profile examples of feedback music at the moment, and this would come from Haldor Farson's Haldorophone, which is recently be played by Hilda Gunnarsdottir on the Joker soundtrack and in Chernobyl. And I think that instrument lends itself really well to film soundtrack music. And so that's kind of high-profile example. But of course there's lots of kind of disparate activity going on. And so yeah, I think part of the network's mission is to form a more of a well-understood concept around what feedback musicianship or feedback music is and what feedback instruments are. But that's ongoing work, really.
Okay, well, thank you for inspiring us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can now move on.